Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's a huge pleasure for me to introduce David Kennedy. He's a colleague of mine at the School of Human Development in Dublin City University in Ireland. So very briefly, he's a theologian who came upon Ricoeur through his research in that area. And he has a book coming out with the publisher Ricœur. The title of it is A Hermeneutics of Religious Education in the Post-Secular Age. And he has a very popular and very impressive podcast series where he interviews philosophers, and it's very highly regarded. So he's going to talk to us today about temporality, recognition, gift. So I'll hand over to David.
Bonjour. Firstly, let me express my deepest gratitude to the Parcours and the organising committee for their kind invitation to speak today. The fact that our course thought continues to challenge us to open up new horizons for thinking, and of course the power that he has to bring people together from such a variety of contexts, as evidenced by this gathering, serves as the testimony not only to the significance of his work, but also to his personhood. And in this sense, it truly is a great privilege to be in your company 20 years after his passing, as we come together to reflect on his final work, The Course of Recognition. From the outset, I'd tempered that the title of my paper set great expectations that only served to actually trip me up in arriving at what I have for you today. It was definitely, not to paraphrase or try to jump on the back of Ricoeur's long path, I kind of had to follow my studies to its end, to only then have to reduce it substantially in size to try and capture it today. So I hope that I haven't lost some of the nuances that were there, but we can discuss them. So upon reading that I'll be discussing Jean-Luc Marion's Phenomenology today, one would be forgiven for assuming that I intend to proceed by making his phenomenology walk the plank, wielding the sword that has been forged by the accomplishment attributed to Ricoeur by Jean-Luc in his famous critique of the theological term, Ricoeur's sustained separation between philosophy and theology, an aspect of his work that Ricoeur himself often referred to as controlled schizophrenia. For as such reflection and philosophical aestheticism not evident in Ricoeur's earlier work, Oneself as Another, where in the pursuit of an autonomous philosophical discourse that could arrive at philosophical conclusions capable of standing in and for themselves, led Ricoeur to intentionally exclude those two final Gifford lectures from the book on the basis of their explicit religious content. Are Ricoeur's insights in Oneself as Another not central to his conceptual development of his second and third figurations in his final work, The Course of Recognition? Surely this rigorous separation between revelation and reason that Jean-Luc so positively associates with Ricoeur over Marion offers the most reasonable ground upon which we ought to take our first step toward Marion's project, which stands vulnerably before us on the plank. However, I do not intend to proceed along those lines. I kind of try to avoid critiques of contamination or counter-contamination. Instead, what I will consider today is the light that Ricoeur's work on recognition casts upon the means by which givingness is actualized in time, an exercise that, I contend, stands opposed to any suggestion regarding an imposition upon givingness. From this standpoint, I will tentatively direct your attention to what I will refer to as a middle path that moves towards complementing a hermeneutics of the gift, such as that offered by Richard Carney, as opposed to challenging it or rejecting it. I can, however, empathize with the sentiments that Ricoeur outlines at the beginning of the Course of Recognition, for the perplexity that I encountered at the outset of my inquiry has not since ceased. This insight, however, is also indicative of the early stage of conceptual development that my proposal is currently at. In the light of this point, I want to make clear that I'm not stating the claim that I've arrived at the path definitively, or even a path for that matter. Rather, this paper attempts to bring to the surface that which I believe to be the beginnings of such a middle path and how it might be conceived. See, I'm talking. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, isn't it? To this end, I've structured my presentation as follows. I will offer an overview of Marion's phenomenology of givingness, with the view to demonstrating that his notion of pure givingness not only renders the subject to a state of passivity, but also reflects a derivative hermeneutics but that these aspects of Marion, because those two critiques are very common of Marion, I believe, as does Adam Graves as well in his recent book, stem from a radical attitude towards language that, if looked at correctly, already from the outset sets him in a contrasting position to the way in which Ricoeur operates and how he sees language. Following from this, I'll obviously, as I just suggested, suggest that the active subject encountered in Ricoeur's exploration of the symbolic exchange of the gift as a call to recognition in the course of recognition shares affinities. That's tentatively saying this because this book, for lack of a better word, has tormented me in actually trying to gather some consistencies. And I was reassured already since yesterday that I'm not alone in the challenge of actually looking at this. I was really beginning to question my own capacities in this regard. And then lastly, from this, I'll attempt to try and synthesize the tensions that I perceive to be between Ricoeur and Marion with the idea of, and again, I flagged these are early, it's an early stage idea, whereby recognition, grounded in a phenomenological receptivity and ethical gratitude, may in fact possess the capacity to maintain the excess of that which is given and the active subject's situatedness in time. However, prior to engaging with an overview of Marion's project, I want to clarify it, the way in which I'm approaching Marion for the purposes today. Today, I tend to focus particularly and exclusively on his philosophical work. Now, I've published elsewhere my sentiments to the effect that, and I still hold, is that you can't possibly really understand, especially when it comes to his notion of the gift in Marion, without recourse to his theology, which first presents in terms of a God beyond being, where we have this recourse back to theology and back even to a biblical theology through saturated phenomenon. Instead, today I'm going to try to stay with the ideal and distance. Stay with being given in excess and the reduction in givingness, and also as well try to capture something to the effect of his more recent attempts to enhance a role of hermeneutics, particularly his Pierre Marquette lecture in 2013, Givenness in Hermeneutics, which he later published in his co-edited volume, The Enigma of the Divine, under the title The Hermeneutics of Givenness in 2020. Through this analysis, I'll attempt to show that despite his efforts and attempts to enrich the hermeneutical dimension of his work, Marion's Givenness still continues to reduce the subject to a passive state, where the subject acts like a prism through which givingness manifests. And it is precisely this aspect of Marion's work that I will later then try to bring Ricoeur's work on recognition to bear. Therefore, I'm not seeking to assess either the legitimacy or illegitimacy of existing critiques of Marion, nor am I trying to, I'm going to try to exercise a bracketing out, if you will, or suspension of judgment in terms of the validity or invalidity of his project as a whole. In Reduction and Givingness and Being Given, Marion mounts his objection to Heideggerian ontology on what he refers to as strictly philosophical grounds. That is to say, on grounds that he considers to be entirely consistent with the original insights, motives, and concerns of Husserlian phenomenology. It is within this context that Marion proposes his threefold historical framework or scheme for understanding the evolution of the phenomenological reduction, a threefold scheme that serves as the armature of his whole philosophical enterprise. Marion's entire philosophical project can be located in the methodological claim on the possibility of phenomenology as this first philosophy. Of course, Husserl was the first to express this programmatically in his first philosophy. For Marion, however, the significance of Husserl's work cannot be understood in isolation, but only in relation to that which follows, Descartes, Kant, Nietzsche, and that which anticipates, Heidegger. Following from this point, he turns not only to Husserl's text, but an entire complex of issues concerning the history of metaphysics to set the stage for the initial conceives of the phenomenological breakthrough as an inevitable succession of three increasingly radical forms of the phenomenological reduction, each of which, according to Marion, draws progressively closer to this pure call or pure givingness. For Marion, this first reduction is offered by Husserl with his transcendental reduction, which, along with his principle of principles, moved to erode or reduce the subject conditions previously imposed upon appearances through the history of metaphysics. Marion argues, however, that this reduction is tied to the constitutive metaphysical definition of presence, objectivity, and therefore only partially clears the way for for that which gives itself as itself. The second search for Marion is offered by Heidegger's existential reduction, which brought us back from beings, objects constituted by a subject, to the being of being. In spite of Heidegger's radicalization of Husserl's founding insights, Marion remains critical of his ontology and argues that Heidegger's preoccupation with ontology has led him to confine phenomenon to the horizon of being, and as a result, he too has failed to achieve the return to the things as they give themselves. From this standpoint, Marion argues that the task falls upon him, very ambitious, to develop a radical vision or version of the reduction, a third reduction, the so-called pure reduction, which will finally be able to lead phenomenology beyond metaphysics. In Reduction and Givenness, Marion refers to this reduction as the pure form of the call. The third reduction is a variation of a principle concerning givenness, which, according to Marion, realizes phenomenology's true potential. This principle, so much reduction, so much givenness. Marion builds its entire phenomenology upon this starting point, from which she ultimately draws the following conclusion: nothing can appear without giving itself. It is on these grounds that Marion claims to have unleashed the reduction's full potential and unveiled a type of phenomenality which involves phenomenon beyond what intentionality originally allows. In this context, we encounter the concept of the saturated phenomenon, which Marion formulates against the backdrop of Husserlian phenomenon, which he argues suffers from a deficit of intuition and therefore a shortage of givingness. Intuition, Marion claims, always needs to be supplemented by an intentional gaze that would, so to speak, fill in the gaps. He asks, to that phenomenon that is often characterized by a deficit of intuition, why would there not correspond the possibility of phenomenon in which intuition would give more, indeed immeasurably more, than intention ever would have intended or foreseen? For Marion, the saturated phenomena is this more. It is this excess of intuition which subverts and therefore precedes every intention that it succeeds in these interests. For Marion, the very possibility of such saturation represents conceptual completion of the most operative definition of the phenomenon, and therefore also of phenomenology, since it alone appears as itself of itself, and starting from itself, since it alone appears without limits of a horizon, and without the reduction to an eye. Heard in its true phenomenological key, therefore, his phenomenology of givingness moves to release phenomena from all constraints, conditions, and limits. By Marion's reversal of the I think, he seeks to constitute a different subject, the gifted, which no longer serves as a condition for the possibility of experience, but in whom givingness is attested in its evidences. Conceived as such, the gift is constituted by the anonymous impact of givingness at play in the circles of intuition. The pure givingness is anonymous because it has no specific giver who gives a specific object to the receiver. This coming into being can only be realized through the intervention of pure givingness, which calls forth through convocation, surprise, interlocution, and the experience of itself as facticity. Here, pure givingness takes over the initiative. Marion's entire project, therefore, is predicated upon an inverse relation between the degree of givingness and the activity of the subject. An increase in the subject activity results in a decrease of the degree of givingness. This is most evident in the final chapter of Being Given, where Marion formulates his notion of the subject as a passive receiver. Contrary to the metaphysical subject, Marion argues that the receiver does not precede what it forms, but rather it results from it. By envisioning the subject as posterior to the given, as an entity which merely and therefore passively receives it, Marion claims that he has ruled out the possibility of the subject actively imposing its own conditions upon the given, which is essential for Marion if he is to maintain the purity of the gift. This conception of passive subjectivity is fully realized, according to Marion, when the subject finally becomes the recipient of a saturated phenomenon. Here, Marion likens the receiver to a transparent screen, which remains invisible up until the very moment that it is struck by a ray of light, by that which is given. When Marion speaks of the gifted as a luminous witness, he does not mean to afford him or her the precedence of initiative, but rather to underline the fact that he's shown on a screen because the light he radiates come to him from elsewhere. Again, this is taken up in his theological work in his most recent book, Revelation from Elsewhere, published last year. Akin to that of an electrical pulse, mind you. In this context, the pejorative of the transcendental self and of transcendental consciousness and the constitutional phenomenology is abolished. This abolition does not, however, infer a destruction of the self nor a death of the self, Rather, the self is not a cause of itself and therefore owes its existence to another ground. The recipient or gifted is rendered passive and active by the imposition of excess intuition of givingness. This theory, I contend, lacks coherency, as it appears to require that both the subject is entirely produced by the given and that it also offers, albeit minimal, resistance to the given which produces it. To use Marion's metaphor, surely the light would remain invisible were it not to appear upon some surface, which is an obstacle to it and stops in blocking it. This surface, this site of impact or deflection, must offer some degree of resistance, and thus it must be distinguishable from the light itself. How then is one to understand the claim that the given gives or produces its own source of resistance? How is this resistance, this reception, to be conceived? Is it not reasonable to assume that the subject's reception of that which is given requires a more active hermeneutical dimension than Marion allows? Marion's conception of givingness not only makes it impossible for him to acknowledge the active role for the interpretive subject, or to see hermeneutic mediation as anything but derivative, it also makes it difficult for him to conceive of language as anything other than obstructive to givingness, and one's reception, therefore, of the gift. Other readers of Marion, such as John Grish, John Gruden, Richard Carney, and even Shane McKinley, to name but a few, have raised similar critiques, and insists obviously that there's a more active interpretation at play, and even actually that Marion's own account or rendering of the saturated phenomena implies a richer, more robust hermeneutic that he is willing to accept. McKinley's critique, for example, hinges on this distinction between two concepts of hermeneutics, ontological and derivative. He associates the former with Heidegger, whereby the subject's active process of interpretation constitutes a necessary condition of possibility for the appearance of any phenomenon, and conceived as such, any given phenomenon will always already be interpreted. He associates the latter with Marion, whereby any active interpretation on the part of the subject will invariably lag behind a prior given, such that the appearance of the given necessarily precedes the hermeneutical moment or act. This leaves little room, obviously, like I've said, for the reception of openness on the part of the subject in any way that reflects anything active. I think that Marion, however, finds himself in greater difficulty than this, in that his conception of the gift appears to be grounded on a fundamental misconception of the nature of language, a radical attitude towards language, which in my wider paper that I had a long digression of tracing it back to early Heidegger. And I think even potentially from what I've heard the last couple of days, in terms of looking at maybe the lack of engagement with Sartre in course of recognition, may actually come back as well to this reading of Heidegger, which comes up, Adam Graves covers it quite well, actually. To be traced back to early Heidegger, where the quest for meaning of being necessitates a return to a primordial experience which precedes certain forms of linguistic articulation and sedimentation. This radical attitude, was reflected in Marion's central idea of the saturative phenomenon, which is based on a recognition that the given often outstrips the conceptual linguistic categories used to understand and interpret it. The call of the given is therefore an anonymous conceptual indeterminateness that resists linguistic determination. Marion has recently tried, however, to accommodate a more hospitable attitude towards language, particularly within carving out a better place for hermeneutics in this phenomenology of givingness. And this can be found in 2013 in his Pierre Marquette lecture, like I mentioned earlier, which is then published, he refined further and published in and of itself as a lecture, and where we break down 4 moments of hermeneutical moments in givingness, but then later in a more cohesive version in the Enigma of the Divine. In these more recent works, hermeneutics not only remains secondary with respect to givingness, it is marked by its essential lateness. But Marion persists in his depiction of hermeneutics as a type of substitute for, or analogue of, constitution itself. The inverse relation between the degree of givingness and the activity as subject to Marion's project, therefore, presents hermeneutics as an imposition of the subject's finitude upon the given, a finitude that is consistently brought out by contrast against the infinity of the obscure givingness. In the light of this discussion, it is evident that in his strictly philosophical work from Reduction and Givingness up to his essay, The Hermeneutics of Givingness, Marion continues to employ a radical approach that seeks to disclose, through a radicalization of the phenomenological reduction, a purely heterological experience of the gift, one that is anterior to objectivity and theoretical reflection, but even more crucial, prior to all modes of linguistic mediation. Reading Marion, therefore, has done little to stifle my own resistance that I harbour in accepting the proposition that it is possible for one to describe a phenomenon that, by definition, this defies all description. Does Marion's radical unilateralism not make the gift impossible to receive or recognise? If so, does it not present that which is given as an abstract ideal that is therefore detached from the ethical life? What does this then mean for the ethical subjects? Are they not undermined? At this point, let us consider Ricoeur's final work on recognition to consider what, if anything, it has to say to a radical phenomenology that, to use the words of Jean-Luc, has abandoned the interrogation of the visible only to take up a blind and imprudent affirmation of radical transcendence. Prior to engaging with Ricoeur's work on recognition, I'd like to provide some clarificatory points that are necessary to contextualize my specific reading of Ricoeur today. Firstly, I want to make clear that Ricoeur does not make any reference to Marion in the course of recognition, obviously, as we're all aware, and therefore I'm not working upon an existing dialogue encountered in the text itself. Secondly, and this point follows from the first, while I'm establishing an encounter between Ricoeur and Marion in this paper, I do not mean to insinuate that any such confrontation ever took place at any point during Ricoeur's lifetime, nor did it with any such confrontation occur between Ricoeur and any younger theologically inclined phenomenologists, for that matter. I did happen to find yesterday, though, 2 letters of correspondence that I didn't manage to get my hands on that correspond at the same time. One was for what I could gather from the little piece I could see in the archives, was a thank you for receiving this free gift of oneself as another, that publication of it. And then 2 years later, it's one that I'm actually a bit devastated over before today that I didn't get to look at, where he responds to oneself as another. So I don't know what's in it. I'd love to see it eventually, but it would have been helpful maybe before today. But look, nonetheless, we know it exists and it's there. Thirdly, it could be argued, and justifiably so, mind you, that Ricoeur's earlier work, such as his Hermeneutics of Existence and the Conflict of Interpretations, which he later moves to the hermeneutic of self and oneself as another, and or even more pointedly, perhaps, his essays on biblical interpretation, and in particular here I'm thinking of those essays on hermeneutic idea of revelation and the hermeneutics of testimony, present a more reasonable, if not more obvious, ground upon which to establish an encounter between Marion and Ricoeur. For example, such an approach is exactly what Adam Graves even takes up in his recent book Exploring Revelation and Heidegger, Marion and Ricoeur. While I do not disagree with such an approach, my interest initially arose actually in the wake of the sparsity, if not total absence of any readings of Marion that explicitly engage with Ricoeur's work on recognition and the course of recognition. I do wonder, however, though, in the absence of such readings, have I either failed to take the hint that was mediated by the silence itself, and in so doing lapsed into an instrumentalist reading of Ricoeur, whereby I've taken his work and forcibly orientated towards my own end. Nevertheless, I leave the task of assessing this to you here today. As has been acknowledged at numerous points during our conversations thus far this week, Ricoeur does not produce a fully fledged theory of recognition in the course of recognition. At the very beginning of the text, he tempers the expectations of any reader who expects to find such a theory comprised therein by indicating that the initial perplexity that motivated his inquiry persists, and as such, his path of recognition moves towards contributing to the ongoing task of forming such a theory. In keeping with the dialectical approach of all of his work, the shortest path between the question and conclusion for Ricoeur is rarely a straight line. Hence, it is perhaps not surprising to find that Ricoeur's path through his 3 figurations of recognition is quite complex. This complexity is intensified, mind you, by the difficulty one encounters when attempting to tease out any explicit lines of cohesive conceptual development that reflect the continuity with his earlier work. Such is this challenge that a reader could paradoxically find themselves trapped in the interpretive cycle akin to that of the romantic hermeneutical theory, in attempting to discern the subjective intentions of Ricoeur as author in writing the text. It is beyond the scope, obviously, of this paper today, if I've already set up myself a big enough task, to effectively deconstruct Ricoeur's final work, at least in any way that would reflect a patient and comprehensive working out through which these intricate network would appear. But I would say that this intricate network appears to be disparate conceptual threads that are characterized just as much by discontinuity as they are by continuity with his earlier workings. Instead, for the present purposes, I've limited my engagement with Ricoeur's text to 1, highlighting some conceptual threads that I believe to reflect at least varying degrees of continuity with his hermeneutics of the self and oneself as another, and in so doing contribute to possible readings of Ricoeur's work on recognition. And two, I will consider his exploration of symbolic exchange of the gift as a call to recognition, whereby Ricoeur, through a development of gratitude as ethical response to being recognized, attempts to move beyond contractual or legal forms of recognition to something more generous and transformative. Following from these efforts, then, I'll attempt to posit a brief synthesis of the tensions from Ricoeur with the view then to, well, where are we now? Where could we possibly go from here? And I do not arrive at a definitive, as I said at the start, answer to this, but hopefully it will be a launchpad maybe to consider where it could possibly go. In the following, then, I'll offer this brief outline in which a reading of oneself as another and the course of recognition, particularly his notions of selfhood, identity, and ethics, appear to be, at least in some varying degrees, expanded, developed within the lens of recognition. In oneself as another, Ricoeur introduces the distinction, idim identity and ipse identity, between sameness and selfhood, all of which everybody is very much aware of today. And in the course of recognition, Ricoeur's second and third figuration, I believe, build upon this distinction through his insistence that recognition is essential for the development of ipse identity, selfhood. Recognition, he highlights, ought not be understood as a mere self-reflection, for it requires acknowledgement from others and institutions. In this way, recognition becomes an intersubjective extension of selfhood, moving beyond internal identity formation to the necessity of social validation. For Ricoeur, therefore, selfhood without recognition remains incomplete. Ricoeur's treatment of the dialectic of ipse identity and idim identity finds its place in his conception of narrative identity in both oneself and another and the course of recognition. In the former, Ricoeur uses the term narrative identity to characterize both the problem and the solution, whereby learning to narrate oneself is always learning to narrate oneself in other ways. In this sense, according to Ricoeur, we construct our sense of self by telling and retelling our life stories, integrating past experiences and ethical commitments. This is always mediated by others, friends, family, and society, who validate or challenge our self-narratives. To use other words, for Ricoeur, the discovery of who one is happens in language and via language. It is inscribed in its essential dialectic nature. Here, Ricoeur is moving beyond the dialectic of idim and the ipse to the dialectic of identity confronted by otherness. In the course of recognition, Ricoeur deepens and expands this aspect of his work in his treatment of recognition as a social act. This unfolds in time across three stages: recognition as identification at the cognitive level, recognizing oneself and others in a descriptive sense; recognition of mutual acknowledgement at the ethical level, acknowledging the other as a moral subject, similar to the way in which he discusses responsibility in oneself as another; and recognition as institutional justice at the political level, expanding here recognition beyond impersonal relations into political and legal structures, addressing then systemic misrecognition as flagged earlier in terms of even Michael's paper. In the light of these points, it could be said that, while in oneself as another, Ricoeur focuses on selfhood in relation to others, in the course of recognition, he highlights that institutions shape and sometimes distort this recognition, which often culminates in systemic misrecognition. Such misrecognition, I think from my reading, and be wrong, I'm open to that being wrong in this sense, it's connected to his treatment of human fragility. And in both oneself as another, and of course recognition, I believe Ricoeur explores human fragility, but it differs in each text. The former fragility appears in the vulnerability of narrative identity, in that we are dependent on others to sustain our self-narrative. In other words, instead of viewing features of human fragility as obstruction or impediment to selfhood, Ricoeur shows that vulnerability is constitutive of self, and as such, that self-understanding is always, and indeed inextricably, a risky matter. In the latter, Ricoeur explores fragility through his treatment of misrecognition, where individuals or groups are denied recognition as a result their sense of self is threatened. It's an interesting here too to point out, not to draw connections too much with the last year, but it would appear that Ricoeur is also working out here some of those initial insights that he has around colonialism, exclusion, and this discrimination in terms of the effects on personal and collective identities, which are worked out in memory, history, and forgetting. Again, this would have to be fleshed out further. In oneself as another, then as well, we have this dialectic of identity. In the course of reckoning, but this dialectic of identity confronted by otherness also shares synergies with his concept of ethics as a response to the call of the other. In oneself as another, Ricoeur grounds his ethics on a dialectic between the self and the other. Here, Ricoeur draws upon the Levinasian ethics to argue that selfhood is not slapstic, but rather arises through responsibility for others. In this context, for Ricoeur, ethics is fundamentally about responding to the other's call. This is also, I think, we find in traces too in Marion, where he takes up Levinas's encounter with the face. This is where we see that orientation in Marion too. Now, they're not one and the same, obviously, but they're two different readings, but they appear in it. In his third figuration, Ricoeur engages with Honnet's notion that misrecognition conceived as a denial of recognition leads to social injustice. And in this context, the ethical responsibility for others, therefore, is not just an individual act, it must be institutionalized in law and society. From this engagement, it could be suggested that perhaps Ricoeur further develops and expands his concept of ethical self-worth from interpersonal responsibility, as in Levinasian ethics, to social and political justice in Honnet's recognition theory and the course of recognition. I'll be the first, however, as I mentioned a couple of times, right, to concede that the points raised here require significantly more work if they're ever to acquire a determination beyond that of possible threats. Nevertheless, these initial discernments piqued my curiosity enough to move me to share them with you today, in the bid to contribute to discussions around the possible deeper reading of the course of recognition. At this point, let me move in a somewhat disparated way to look at the exchange of the symbolic exchange of the gift as a call to recognition, the view to highlighting his development of gratitude as an ethical response to being recognized, which will then allow us to discern some key tensions between Marion and Ricoeur. In the course of recognition, Ricoeur treats gratitude as a response to being recognized, an ethical dimension that moves beyond the contractual or legal forms of recognition into something more generous and transformative. Here, recognition is not just about cognitive identification, I recognize this person, or juridical acknowledgement, I grant them rights, but also involves a deeper ethical dimension, mutual recognition in the form of gratitude. Gratitude for Ricoeur, in this sense, I believe, is an acknowledgement of the gift of recognition. When we are seen and valued by the other, we feel a sense of indebtedness, not in a transactional way, but in a relational and moral way. He contrasts this with more formal or institutional forms of recognition, i.e. legal rights, social status, and in the view to arguing that gratitude represents a more spontaneous and generous form of recognition. Drawing on Maas's theory of the gift, Ricoeur explores how recognition and gratitude function outside of strict economic or legal exchanges. It is here we encounter the quote that adorns all of our lovely conference bags that we've got the other day, whereby it says the struggle for recognition would lose itself in the unhappy consciousness if it were not given to humans to be able to accede to the actual, albeit symbolic, experience of mutual recognition following the model of the reciprocal ceremonial gift. Unlike a transaction where something is given in expectation of return, a gift, and by extension, recognition, involves asymmetry. One does not necessarily deserve recognition, but when received, it creates a moral obligation to respond, often through gratitude. I digress again. What comes to mind here, even though it's not referenced in the text, but I've mentioned it to a couple of people in conversation today, is the city of God and Augustine's treatment of sacrifice, in where he sets up trying to distinguish between the Christian conception of prayer and worship, as opposed to the conception of God as this all-knowing authority, saying, look what I've done for you, come give it, you should come worship me, but rather it's freely given. And I think there's threads of this through his treatment of the agape as well in the work, but that's maybe too much to look at, to explore today. Nevertheless, this suggests that recognition, when freely given, fosters reciprocity, but not only necessarily in one-to-one exchange. Gratitude is an expression of this non-calculative reciprocity. Gratitude therefore plays a reparative role. It can mend broken relations and counteract misrecognition by re-establishing mutual esteem. While legal and political recognition ensure rights and equality, Ricoeur suggests that gratitude presents a higher form of ethical life that goes beyond mere obligation. Political recognition can be demanded and enforced, but gratitude depends on goodwill and generosity. Justice requires fairness and equal treatment, but gratitude restores relationships, acknowledging past injustices in a way that law alone cannot. Ricoeur's discussion of gratitude ultimately humanizes recognition. It is not just about right status or institutional validation, but about how recognition fosters deeper ethical relationships between individuals and communities. Recognition at its fullest includes gratitude as a way of acknowledging the gift of being seen and valued. In light of the above readings of Ricoeur and Marion, it's possible to highlight some points of tension. One, obviously, between recognition and givenness, whereby Marion's phenomenology of givenness suggests that certain phenomena, especially saturated phenomena like law of beauty or revelation, are given in excess, overwhelming the subject and bypassing interpretive structures. In contrast, Ricoeur's course of recognition emphasizes that identity and recognition require historical, linguistic, and intersubjective processes. He argues that recognition is not simply received, but involves an active negotiation with others, history, and social institutions. The implication, therefore, even if something is given, it must be recognized, meaningfully situated within a narrative and ethical framework. This directly challenges Marion's idea that saturated phenomena, including that of divine revelation, can be fully apprehended without the mediation of interpretation. And one thing that can be often missed in reading Marion through, often can read Marion and go, oh, there's been a contamination of theology into his phenomenology. But reading it back into, he leaves very little room for the role of faith on the part of the believer for his understanding and interpretation of revelation. Marion's subject, the gifted, is fundamentally passive, receiving meaning from givenness. This subject does not constitute experience, but is constituted by what is given. Ricoeur, in contrast, sees recognition as an active and iterative process in which individuals construct their identity through a dynamic interplay of self-recognition, mutual recognition, and institutional recognition. Rather than being merely given, identity is formed through acknowledgement and interpretation, suggesting a more active and dialogical role for the subject than Marion allows. In the course of recognition, Ricoeur discusses recognition as social and ethical acts, moving from self-recognition to mutual recognition between persons and finally to institutional recognition in society. Marion, on the other hand, focuses more on a phenomenology of excess and how the given phenomenon, such as love or relations, shapes the recipient. Ethical life depends on structures of recognition rather than sheer givingness. For instance, love is not simply an overwhelming saturated phenomenon, as Marion describes it, but requires mutual acknowledgement and reciprocity, as Ricoeur suggests. Marion often argues that experiences like love and divine revelation do not require conceptual mediation. They give themselves beyond the limits of subjectivity. Ricoeur, however, would argue that even the most profound experiences require hermeneutical work. They must be integrated into memory, identity, and recognition processes. No experience, no matter how overwhelming, can bypass the structures of language, history, and interpretation. The process of recognition ensures that what is given becomes meaningful to the recipient. In the light of these tensions, I wonder if it's possible to move beyond what appears to be a series of conceptual impasses between Ricoeur and Marion. And forgive me for sounding a bit like a nursery rhyme, but not by going over it, under it, around it, but through them. If so, what might we come to recognize? I suggest that if we were to begin to move in this direction and possibly open up a middle path whereby recognition could be conceived not as a mastery of exchange, but as humble receptivity, a form of gratitude that opens us to what exceeds us without immediately demanding interpretation of return. Recognition in this sense is not contamination, but rather a mode of attuned openness to the gift's excess. Here, the gift might be understood as freely given, but gratefully received. It is not owed nor claimed, but held in a stance of, to hijack your word from earlier in the week, I think, wonder and ethical responsiveness. It's possible, therefore, to conceive of this phenomenology of gratitude as a quiet moment of being touched by the gift, which calls forth a narrative and ethical response, not as repayment, but as a continuation of the gift's unfolding in time. Might such an approach preserve the unconditionality emphasized by Marion, while one at the same time embracing Ricoeur's insights that recognition involves a responsive selfhood embedded in mutual solicitude and ethical relation? Such an approach, I imagine, could be contrasted, but in a spirit of complementarity with Richard Carney's hermeneutics of the gift, which emphasizes that the gift must be interpreted and answered as a relational call. While the approach I'm evocatively alluding to today affirms the call's relationality. As I imagine it currently at these early stages, would stress the response that emerges from a foundational receptive posture that is so enmeshed in the interpretive processes of recognition, akin to that infamous quote around friendship at the end of the course of recognition, where it's alluded to where we talk about the soul as mingling and blending with each other, that they efface the scene, so much so that they cannot find it again. So in this sense, what I mean to convey is that in talking about this moment of givingness, or this space for silence, it's so enmeshed within the interpretive process. I'd struggle to suggest right now or call it a first step. It's too indistinguishable for me, anyway, right now. And I caution putting it as a step, because I wonder if putting it at that step, would we then also fall to an a priori of where we're putting, let's say, what I've put here really is that it points to a greater appreciation for not merely the temporal conditions of the gift, but rather the spatio-temporal conditions of the gift, one that may allow for silence, dwelling, and gratitude as modes of recognition. Thank you for listening. And apologies for the length.
No, you couldn't read about that. Time for questions.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely magistral. I'm wondering, I was waiting for this. I was wondering if you would have any ideas or further ideas. It always struck me that the great distinction, differentiation between Marion and so this phenomenology of the excess, this eclectic phenomenology that's exploded, like Jean-Luc said, and Ricoeur was on the question of justice. Because it seems to me that Marion's saturated phenomena is so excessive that it excessively suspends and brackets out the question of justice. Whereas it seems to me that through what you just showed, that is through this modality of recognition, of mutual recognition, which is not the Hegelian, as you very clearly marked, which is not a recognition of reconciliation, but on the contrary, a recognition of perpetual excess of givenness within the mutuality of recognition. There seems to be a place for justice. Yeah, and there is a place, obviously, for justice. So I'm wondering if the true, and I appreciate everything you said, I'm wondering if the true confrontation is not between Ricoeur and Givenness, because Givenness, as you know, carves out in this excess hyperbolical ethics the place of the third, the place of justice, right? So here, I think there would be a very profound confrontation between Ricoeur and the concept of justice. And since we were talking about the question of time, remember that Givenness has a whole diachronie, a temporality of diachronie, which is absolutely not at all Marion, and a little bit sometimes Ricoeur approaches it, but then moves away from. So maybe as a suggestion, perhaps Givenness Ricoeur would be an interesting one.
Yeah, thank you. That's really encouraging. Like, so just even with that, like that's I wondered what the response would be to what I was presenting today, because for me it was a process of discernment even in and of itself. I really learned a lot even from the process, and actually the challenge I had was that there were so many directions and themes that emerged through it that, like, hopefully, if I'm lucky enough, I'll get to spend the rest of my working life trying to engage with and tease out. Yeah. And I still consider myself like so early in my reading of Ricoeur that I'm mindful of the judgments that I'm arriving to unqualified, if you get me, through wider reading. So it's encouraging to hear that at least there is some satisfaction from what I took from it. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so Sarah has a question.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I really don't know Marion's philosophy, so it's a clarification question. I was wondering if you could clarify this idea of forgiveness. And because my doubt is that I can understand the idea of this phenomenology that explodes and in a certain way exceeds what we can properly intend. But I don't know how to picture this idea of forgiveness as something like completely overwhelming and that you said at a certain point precedes any linguistic determination. And at a theoretical level, where does this notion stand in a sense, is it a kind of methodological abstraction, or in concrete we have really, according to Marion, these forgiveness?
Yeah, right. So there's a couple of ways in which you could take that, in my reading of Marion anyway. One stems from a charge that I've thought of when I was going along, but it's not coming of my own making either. Whereas that he's not very good at distinguishing either too clearly between the saturated phenomenon and phenomenon. Like it's whilst he talks about it in terms of revelation and love, I think he could be far clearer in terms of his delineation of, well, when do we suddenly arrive in saturated phenomenon? And surely if we look at our relationality and being in the world, so many other ordinary experiences are full of this excess, you know? The other aspect you could look at too, which I think theoretically speaking, which I tried to, a longer section in the paper previously, was the reading of Heidegger, right? So on early Heidegger and the two different, what I call it, the radical attitude towards language, was Marion and Ricoeur both see the given in time. Marion speaks more anteriorly before in that sense, whereas we have Ricoeur before the text, and we have this far more spatial dimension to it as well. But this is what I was kind of hinting at earlier about the Sartre part in the course recognition, was that the thread through Sartre of reading of Heidegger that results in a humanism, in a sense, acts as a barrier, actually, in fact, to some of the early threads in Heidegger's in terms of disclosing being. Again, this comes back here again to the readings of language and the approach of early Heidegger and later Heidegger. So it depends on what way you see it. One of the critiques with Heidegger's reading is that he's so preoccupied with ontology and overcoming metaphysics that he ends up just kind of bypassing the real question of hermeneutics, which Ricoeur so richly brings about in his hermeneutics of the human sciences. So like I think there's not a simple singular answer to that point. I think it's complicated, but there's theoretical threads that you can bring through whatever reading you're taking. But in terms of here is a definition of pure givingness, in the sense of like here it stands in a theoretical and methodological approach, I think you'd have to look at, it comes back to that his threefold reduction and his schematism and how he's actually engaging with Husserl, Heidegger, and then what he befalls and takes on himself, you know, like he self assigns himself this task, you know. So like not to get in terms of somebody mentioned earlier, the narcissistic self or narcissistic imagination, but in the sense of like this was a task he took on himself. So in one sense, you see now even in his later theological work, right? So I didn't get into it today, but like really, if you are to look at his phenomenology, which is critiqued obviously as trying to cover over those theological tracks, John, I'm doing philosophy here, John. We can't escape God beyond being, where we look at it's given, we look at Paul's experience. So this is I can, in one sense, I can understand what Marion is trying to achieve in the case of religious phenomena, in terms of where we look at as ecstasy, when we look at even like the likes of Rudolf Otto's experience of the other, the idea of the holy, you know, and this radical, this luminous experience. Yeah. But when you break it down to the pragmatics of how we actually look at, well, where does the subject sit within this? I think Marion's project is inadequate, to put it simply. And that's my view.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. Could you say a bit more about, because you just said it in passing and I'm very interesting, what Augustine does with what Ricoeur does with Augustine and the city of God?
Oh no, so no, I will caution that one, but that's what I call a me meandering. As I was reading was because it was going off.
So can you
I
say
can.
something specific?
Oh yes,
we
I
only
can.
have 5.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, probably an easy way for me to describe is that one of my first philosophical or theological books that I've read was Confessions, and I fell in love with it. And then that led me on to then finding The City of God, this big tome of a book that lands on the table. And in my work around sacramental theology and looking at the idea of liturgical worship and the idea of, well, why, like, what do we mean when we say to give thanks in terms of the receipt of the gift? Marion approaches this when looking at the Eucharist in terms of the exchange of the gift, and he highlights the transactional exchanges and in comparison to the mediated exchanges. In the City of God in Augustine, what Augustine really sets up, and he's thinking here in his mind around the pagan sacrifices of the Roman Empire and in early Christianity that was going on around the periods, conceptions of ritualistic worship, whereby a conception of God in being God isn't one of dominion. You know, isn't my relationship isn't because I made you, I own you. And as I own you, you need to abide by me and give me what I want right now, like a stubborn child. If anything, you're ascribing upon God, Augustine says here, a humanity that is unbecoming of God in one sense, and also you're suggesting that the givingness of infiniteness, of if it's infinite love, and if it's infinite relationship in this regard, how can I possibly suggest that he has any inclination or wish for me as an individual, let's say, sitting here, that I need to now suddenly go and say thanks because he requires me to, rather than my response in faith, you know? So this is where I have a problem with Marion, too, is that if we take out this faith part, even in his theology of revelation, and we reduce it so much, where do we become then? Where am I then, as, let's say, a believer, in terms of my response to that which is given? You know?
Thank you. So we have about 3 minutes left, and Michael has a question. Right? It has to be fast.
Thank you for this talk. It was great. I had a class with Marion in the 90s where he taught oneself as another, although he didn't teach, he had students present. But
Genius.
the way in which one can also approach the same problematic that you have explained to us very well through Givenness could be done by reading Ricoeur and Marion on Descartes. Because Marion is also, the scholar of Descartes, and they interacted many times over this question of not only God's existence, but the world's existence, the cogito, and so forth. So that's
for Eileen's proofing it here. So in one of the parts that I cut out of my introduction was that, in fact, there are a number of ways in which one could set about bringing the tensions evident between the work of Marion and Ricoeur to the surface. During the early stages of conceiving this paper, I had even entertained the idea of attempting to use the respective post-Arcelian readings of meditations, specifically their differing interpretations of Descartes' use of the term recognize as an organizing principle to present the tensions evident therein. And I said, basically, I stepped back from this edge because I was trying to be somewhat realistic, not only of my own abilities, but also in terms of the time today. Yeah.
So that's his way of saying thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for being here. Thank you.